Hello! In this video, we'll take a look at a few techniques I use when grading in HDR. I'll start by briefly talking about the PQ curve, and then show you how to grade a low-key clip with nice punchy highlights. I'll also show you the limitations of working with 8-bit footage. An important note before starting, which will make things more easy for you, is that color grading for an HDR10 delivery is no different from grading for a Dolby Vision delivery, since both are based on the PQ curve. And the differences lies more in limitations in maximum brightness for the respective format, and mainly in the mastering process. A benefit from grading in HDR is that I oftentimes achieve a much better SDR version by first grading in HDR and later converting to SDR, compared to if I would grade directly in SDR from the beginning. Some suggest that even if you're delivering only in SDR, you should still grade in HDR first, and then convert to SDR for the best results. Another interesting thought that I picked up from colorist Kevin Shaw is that even if you're doing an HLG delivery, which is more of a high dynamic range broadcast format, it might be a good idea to grade in PQ first, and then later transform to HLG, which in some cases the broadcasters are able to do themselves. And from what I understand, it's not a problem to get a good conversion going from PQ to HLG, but the other way around can cause problems if you later would be asked to deliver in, for example, HDR10 or Dolby Vision. Now, as I mentioned during the introduction, in PQ HDR, about half of the code values lies in the 100 nit SDR range, with most of those located in the darker half of that range. This allows for great shadow detail, while at the same time being able to produce highlights up to 10,000 nits. What you need to think about though is to be mindful when making, for example, a sky very bright, since there are less code values the higher up you go. And this can cause problems such as banding, because you're essentially working in quantization equivalent of 8 bits or even 6 bits, depending on how bright you make it. Another tip before you start grading is that you, in some cases, might want to enable the node HDR mode on an active node. This function is intended to give your grading controls a feeling which more closely resembles what you might be used to when working in SDR. It's especially when working with the luminance range of the image, in, for example, the color wheels palette or when using the custom curves, then you might notice an improvement when enabling the node HDR mode. Try it out for yourself and see how you like it. So let's go to the next clip. I'm going to start by bringing up the scopes and set the waveform monitor to the YRGB parade. The first adjustment I want to do is to adjust the exposure, and when adjusting the exposure I like to work in linear. This is really nice for us who like to shoot overexposed, to be able to get the image back into the proper range. Here I have an image that I would like to darken. To do that, I set up 3 nodes with 2 color space transforms. One on the first node and one on the last node. The first one goes from timeline gamma into linear. And the second goes from linear back into the timeline gamma. In between these color space transforms, I make the exposure adjustment. Now, what's quite nice is that you'll get an accurate reading in stops when adjusting the gain wheel. For example, going from 1 to 0.5 lowers the brightness by 1 stop. And going to 0.25 lowers it by 1 more stop, to a total of 2 stops. Of course, it's the same thing when brightening an image, but that's hopefully something you won't have to do very often, as this will introduce more noise into the shadows, which has a tendency to become even more noticeable in HDR compared to SDR. Next, I like to set my shadows and increase the contrast by using the curves. If I select editable splines, it's possible to get a nice S-shaped curve. Now, the log highlight wheel is a tool which really comes in handy when working in HDR. It allows you to target a much narrower range than what you're able to do with the gain wheel, and works more like a secondary adjustment, where the rest of the image is isolated from the correction. Here I'm going to raise the highlights to 0.6, and make them pop a bit more. By doing so, we can see some difference, but I think all the small dots of light from the lamps could pop a bit more. Down here, it's also possible to set the range of the image you want to target with the log wheels. By By default, the high range is set to 0.55, and I'm going to lower it to 0.4. Now this makes a huge difference, and the lights now really stands out in the image, which is in this case what I want. If I activate the extents in the waveform monitor, you can see the peaks reaching just over 1000 nits. To add saturation, I'm going to use a plugin which is included with Studio version of Resolve, called Dehaze. As you might notice, we now get some really ugly compression artifacts that's noticeable especially in the sky, towards the sunset. This is because the video file is encoded in H.264 with an 8-bit quantization, and when working especially in HDR, 8-bit low encoded footage is the worst. The clip was originally shot in ProRes or maybe even RAW, but I had deleted the original file and only saved this one, which I now regret deeply. Anyway, I think the saturation is a bit too high, so I'm going to blend the Dehaze plugin to 0.5, and the compression artifacts may also be a bit less visible, hopefully. Now, before ending this video, I would like to talk a bit more about shadows. One thing you might notice when working in HDR is that the greater latitude can result in more nuanced shadows, where the whole image becomes less squashed, which frees up space below the midtones. According to Dolby, the logarithmic nature of the PQ curve also contributes to better details in the blacks and shadow areas compared to SDR, because the shadows holds a lot of the code values of the PQ curve. And according to colorist Kevin Shaw, when grading in HDR, the exposure can often tend to be a bit higher than in SDR, for example half a stop brighter. This also creates more room in the shadows, and can contribute to greater shadow detail. Now, a potential issue with high dynamic range video that you should be aware of, which is also related to shadow detail, is flare. Flare becomes an issue when the light emitted from the display bounces around the room and back to the screen, making the darker shadows hard to distinguish. And this is something to think about while grading. Since you can work with a variable white and black point, it may also be a good idea to raise the blacks in very bright scenes. And since the contrast ratio is still very high, the picture won't look washed out even with the blacks raised. So let's go to the next video, where I'll show you how I addressed clipping in HDR.